Welcome to the Content Strategy Track. Taking the stage now is Tony Zambito, and he will be talking to us next about how to use buyer personas to create content that matters to buyers. Welcome, Tony.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here today. It's a real pleasure to have all of you in the audience today, and it's just great to be in New York. I do want to thank the conference organizers, and there are many of you I have not met before, and there's many of you that we've exchanged Twitters and LinkedIn, so please find me and introduce yourself to me, and I'll do likewise. I'm really eager to meet many of you today. So we're going to talk about buyer personas, and we're going to talk about content. And what I hope to do today is to give you a few thoughts that you can leave with, not only from a conceptual standpoint, but also from a practical standpoint. So a little bit about me. Haven't been in personas my whole life. I had a prior career heading up sales and marketing organizations, and was very fortunate to be at the origin of the persona movement, which was really created around the user-centered design movement back in the late 90s. So I had the privilege of working with some pretty incredible people on the concept of personas and how they were originated. And taking that experience, I had always this question in my mind: why can't we do this for sales and marketing? Why is it only possible for product design? And so what I did in 2001 is said, look, there's got to be a methodology that we can do for sales and marketing. So that's what I've been doing now for the past dozen years or so. I have conducted 1,000+, if you will, buyer interviews. So I stand here before you today not as an advocate of personas, but as an advocate of buyers. This application can be done at a Fortune 100 level to a small, medium enterprise. So let's take a look at something here. Life used to be simple. Everybody had the dream. The car and the nice house. That was the big American dream. Business used to be simple. People used to go down on Main Street or have simple businesses that served small communities. Information used to be simple. It used to be on billboards, TV, newspaper. And choices used to be simple. People would go down to Main Street, you can select a building. Or then after Main Street came the mall, you could go to different malls. Most business-to-business communities were pretty local back in the day. Then this happened. We are in the midst of probably the most incredible transformation ever taken place from an economic point of view. We are seeing the manifestation of a truly global digital economy that is turning the world upside down. And that world includes buyers, people's behaviors. It includes how people and businesses conduct relationships. And this is also happening. We are in the midst of a buyer revolution. It's no longer simple. People are communicating tablets, mobile, many different ways. We've got different kinds of peer relationships going on at the same time. So what has this done? It has caused content marketers to think that content is king, which has led to this. Now, I said I've done thousands and thousands of buyer interviews, and one of the most consistent patterns that I hear over and over, particularly in the last few years, is there a way that you could turn it off? We get so much email. We get so much, things in the mail, Twitter this, LinkedIn that. Email box is just incredible. I use like 3 different emails now so that I can manage this. So it's overwhelming. So a message here is that you have to look at content marketing and not marketing content. And that's a big fine line to understand where that is. And really what we want to do, and why we are all here today and why you are here today, is how can we make content relevant at the fingertip of a buyer? How do we do that? So let's take a look at buyer personas real quickly. Buyer personas are archetypical representation of real people, real customers, that's based on qualitative research. And what you're looking for is not a profile. You are looking for an actual representation of a person and their behaviors. Profiling, I'd like you to think about profiling in the context of like, well, this is who we target. But when we look at personas, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to gain an understanding of what matters. Why does a certain type of content matter? What goals matter? And why do these certain choices matter? So, in my opinion, and I know there's controversy around this, my opinion, there's a big difference between a buyer profile and a buyer persona. A buyer profile, to me, is in the context of who you might target. And there are things that go along with that, like, for example, some demographics or firmographic information, some sales intelligence information around buying criteria, for example. But what we want to do with buyer personas, and why they're so important to content, is we want to get to the underneath layers of what goals are important and what really matters to this person. The big thing we want to do is we want to move beyond the how. So if we look at history for a second, from about 1970 to 2008, there was a lot of concepts around the sales funnel. So we had to manage the sales funnel. And marketing had its role at the top, maybe not as deep as it is now, for example. And then the last 2 years, there's been a lot of talk about the buyer's journey. And how do we map to the buyer's journey? The thing I want to bring to your attention today is a big takeaway is this. We need to move from how to why. And one way you can do that is through context-based scenarios. And what I'm seeing is a major shift here in two areas. The buyers that I've interviewed are overwhelmed with this buying journey perspective, and I'll talk about that in a little bit about the profiling and the number of pieces of content. Also, their world has changed. Their world has changed to where they are confronted with different scenarios happening every year. So if we are not in tune with the different scenarios that are confronting them, then we can't help them. So if we're only concerned about looking at this journey and the how, we can't get involved in looking at what scenarios are confronting buyers today and how do we help them and why is it important that we help them. So scenarios tell us stories. What goals are important to Sandy? I'm going to introduce Sandy to you. Sandy Clark. She's a VP of Customer Service, Customer Experience for a company called Ironworks. And what scenarios can do is this. Scenarios are designed to help us find out what we don't know. So when we do qualitative research, we are trying to find what we don't know. We are trying to find the unarticulated, and we are trying to find the not so obvious. And some of these questions that you see here are the appropriate, if you will, means of finding out what we don't know. And this is really the power of personas right here. What goals are important to Sandy, and what is she trying to accomplish? What set of attitudes, beliefs, and perception influence her decision? That definition right there is your definition of a mental model. We've heard that a couple of times already. A mental model is one of the core foundations of personas from way back in the late 90s. It's been a very important part of personas. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to aggregate a collective set of attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions into a powerful model that you can understand and understand how it influences decisions. The next thing that you see there is what choices. Choices that matter. And why do they matter? choice is a very powerful thing. So when you are looking at personas, you also are really trying to dive deep into what choices matter to Sandy right here. And then you say, all right, what scenarios are confronting Sandy? So Sandy could have several scenarios confronting her at the same time. Think of that. And I have an example for you of how that plays out. But think of this. At any point in time in an organization, there could be multiple scenarios happening at the same time. And we tend to think that there probably is only one case of something within the context of our product and service. Think of scenarios that are a form of confrontation for a buyer. They could have multiple scenarios happening at the same time. Who does Sandy interact with and why? So we want to create this particular story about Sandy and who she's interacting with. And what does Sandy need to know and why? So this pertains very, very much to content. What does she need to know and why does she need to know it? These are powerful questions that in essence represent the definitions of buyer personas right here. The power of personas is to help you understand what we don't know. So if we could get answers to these kinds of questions through qualitative research, then they help us to know exactly the types of content, the form of content, the substance, and the style of content that's going to make a difference. So when we look at the core of buyer personas, there are several tools that are in there. And unfortunately, we only have a half hour, so I can't go through each one of these. But the core pieces of buyer personas is, first and foremost, it's a goal-directed methodology. So we're really trying to hone in on the goals of our buyers. The second thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to understand these powerful mental models that are taking place. And we also want to know about these different scenarios. What is actually happening in that business? And are there more than one? Are there more than two? We also want to know the level of interaction that's happening. We also want to know some things about their experiences. And we want to know about their knowledge needs. And last but not least, we want to know about the choices that they're confronted with. And what did that choice represent? So when you look at buyer personas, you are trying to understand the story of your buyers. And buyer personas represent a communications platform for not only understanding your buyers, but to help communicate to the rest of the organization about your buyers. So it's really important to know the story of your buyers. Because unless you know the story of your buyers, you're not going to be able to then tell them a story yourself. So in order to get from a point of understanding who they are, what drives their motivations, what drives their goals, what choices they have to make, put that in a context of a story. And with that understanding, then the next phase for you is to develop a story that they can relate to. So the power of buyer personas in terms of content is understanding their story. And here's a caution I have for you. I stand here again as an advocate of the buyer. I've done thousands of buyer interviews on behalf of organizations. And one of the things that is out there, and I'm going to give you the buyer's perspective, is this. Be careful about mathematical profiling. And I stand here as an advocate for the buyer. So if we take Sandy, for example, sometimes Sandy is profiled in the terms of her function, some initiatives, some criteria, products, success factors, and we see this happening a lot. We're trying to map to the buyer's journey It could be a couple verticals. It could be 4 profiles that were completed. There are 6 stages. There are 4 pieces of content for each stage, which is about 200 pieces of content. You know what I say? Stop the insanity. Because what you're going to get is you're going to get that image of all the pieces flying out of that computer. This is how it feels to buyers today. They're overwhelmed with it. And they're looking for things that matter to them. So typically, it doesn't take long now in buyer interviews of a pattern to be established right off the bat, which is we get way too much email, or is there any way that we could turn this off? So my message to you is that your job has just gotten harder because buyers are raising the expectations. Look, we get it. Buyers are saying, we get it. We get it that they want to send us this stuff, but somehow it's got to be more manageable. And it's got to be relevant to what we're trying to do. We've got scenario-based content planning. I want to spend a little time on this because I want you to be able to walk away with some practical sense here. Content needs to be mapped back to the goals and the scenarios and the stories that are important to Sandy. So it's really important to understand, first off, the goals of Sandy, what scenarios confront her, what stories is she involved in, and how do you map back to that? You also want to produce information, whether it's video or other forms of media, that mirror Sandy's scenario. So in other words, if Sandy comes to your site, or Sandy receives something from you, it has to evoke an emotion that says, hey, this is the scenario I'm involved in right now. This is my situation. It has to evoke an emotion today. You know, if they're only going to spend 15 seconds on your site, how do you capture that emotion in that first 15 seconds? You cannot do it with some form of message that might be generic, that might be, caricature-like. And what I mean by that is that's another pitfall of buyer personas. I've seen a lot of caricature-like buyer persona work that actually could have a real bad downside effect, if you will. And so, if they get that feeling, that's an evoking emotion too as well, that, hey, this is not for me. So the idea is that you want to evoke an emotion that says, hey, this is my scenario right now. This is my situation. You want to create micro scenarios. A micro scenario offers up an alternative view of the future. This is where creativity comes into play. This is where insight comes into play, where you are creating. You want the buyer to have an emotion that evokes with him or her that says, oh, I see an alternative future. I see something different. Or I see, wow, this is my scenario now, this is my challenging situation now, but I see a vision of what it could look like. This interests me. Same thing with micro stories. Micro stories is the sense of how do you help somebody understand what I just said, that vision. So in other words, you offer up a micro scenario that offers an alternative view of the future, and then there's a micro story to go with it. Because that person now has an interest of hearing more about this particular story. So be prepared to first offer up an alternative view of the future, and then offer up a micro story that engages that customer to dive deeper into that. You want to connect the micro stories and micro scenarios to potential outcomes that involve Sandy in this particular case. If we tie the concept of buyer personas back to mapping to goals and mapping to scenarios, you get this understanding. So your content then has to say this. Okay, I'm Sandy. I like this alternative view of the future. I like this story that could take place. And you know what? These potential outcomes are exactly appealing to me, even though some of these outcomes I didn't even think about before. So the idea is this. You have the sense of understanding their current scenario or multiple scenarios. Then you want to shift to say, look, we understand this. We're with you. And here's an alternative view of what this scenario could look like. And by the way, this is the story of that scenario, and these are the potential outcomes that can happen if you engage in this story. If we have a relationship, this is what the outcome could look like. So now you've got a way of connecting to Sandy on an emotional, personal level, evoking an emotion, in appealing to the things that matter to her. And we've had some conversation today about challenging the status quo and trying to get them to think differently. This is the way you can do that. You can offer up an alternative view, an alternative story, and brand new potential outcomes that they probably may have not thought about before. Let me talk through this a little bit. This is an organization in the Bay Area of California called Genesis. What you see here is designed to evoke an emotion. So if we take the first one up there, it says, take your customer experience to the next level. And if we think about our persona, Sandy, Sandy is thinking, somehow, some way, I've got to respond to competition. And this competition is brand new. We've never had this before. It was introduced 4 months ago, and I am on the hot seat. And somehow, some way, in a short amount of time, I've got to take customer experience to the next level. So she looked at that, and she said, you know what? We don't have really good dealings with iPhones today. People are still kind of tethered to the web when they're interacting with us. I'm evoking an emotion right off the bat right there. I have an image that evokes an emotion that I could get this organization to the next level. Also, engage customers where they interact. Sandy's struggling. She says, hey, not everybody works in an office building. How do we manage this? So there you see, and it's evoking an emotion. Here's a person with a surfing board up there, ready to go surfing. And it's a whole different level of interaction that we've got to have. And then differentiate your customer experiences. She's trying to figure out, how do we differentiate? So she's got multiple scenarios going on here. First scenario is, look, we're way behind in technology. Okay. Second scenario is, you know what? Our customer base has spread all over the world. It's global. And you know what? They're not really confined to any one building anymore. And we're not doing a good job of that. And also, our competition in the last 4 months have skyrocketed to 2 cloud-based organizations, and we've got to find a way to differentiate. So you're evoking an emotion that comes back to the scenario that she's faced with. So this is an example of a company that I think is doing it well, called Genesis. And right off the bat, when you go, you can see here that they are tapping into scenarios, they're tapping into goals, and they're tapping into this emotion. So remember these? Got the picture of the life was simple, business was simple, information was simple, and choices were simple. Let me introduce you to the artist and photographer, Michael Paul Smith. And what Michael Paul Smith does is he recreates these scenes on a miniature scale. And then he takes photographs of them that look like this. Okay? So what is the real story of your buyers? Sometimes we think it's this. And what personas do for content is that help illuminate the realities. So this is what we're after. When you do qualitative research, you are trying to illuminate the reality from here's what we think the story is to here's the reality. That's the power of personas. You really are trying to get to understanding the reality of the story of your buyers, and you want to be able to map back to that reality. So, here's the saying. If content is king, then context is everything. And what we just saw there was the importance of context, really understanding these scenarios. And that example of Michael Paul Smith is a great example. Because you could be lulled into thinking those pictures are real. Those are real towns, those are real vehicles. And lo and behold, there's a whole different reality to it. And let me leave you with this thought. If there is a tension point right now in the world of marketing and buyers, the tension point is this. Based on thousands of interviews, is buyers struggle with feeling that marketers, sellers, organizations understand their realities. So that's what I hear over and over. They don't get us. They don't understand us. So the more you can evoke that emotion through scenarios and stories, micro scenarios and micro stories that show an alternative vision that tells a deeper story of a new relationship and a deeper story of new potential outcomes, it evokes that emotion of, you know what? This could be a good relationship because they understand me. They get the realities of what I'm confronted with. And that's really how to use personas, is to illuminate these realities and illuminate a new vision, a new story, and new potential outcomes. So thank you very much. It's been a great joy to be able to talk with you today.